Daniel Hawk walked briskly down the crowded street, his polished shoes tapping rhythmically against the concrete, his mind consumed by numbers, contracts, and the cold promises of the boardroom. To the world, Daniel was a man of immense wealth and influence. Untouchable, relentless, a self-made billionaire who carved his empire from the very stone of the corporate world. But in the midst of all the power and money, something essential had been lost: his heart. He didn't see the girl at first, just a flash of movement, a fleeting shadow among the mass of pedestrians. His instincts, honed by years of vigilance, kicked in just a moment too late. Before he could react, his hand went instinctively to his pocket, and his stomach tightened. His wallet, thick with cash and business cards, was gone. For a brief, rare moment in his life, Daniel felt the sting of vulnerability. "Thief!" he shouted, his voice cutting through the bustling street like a whip. A young girl, no older than 16, looked back at him with wide, terrified eyes. She was small, with ragged clothes and dirty, matted hair that fell in clumps around her face. For a split second, their gazes locked, and then, like a startled rabbit, she turned and bolted. Daniel's blood boiled. How dare anyone try to steal from him? His mind flooded with rage, but his body responded with a sharp focus. Without thinking, he gave chase. The girl darted through the throngs of people, her thin frame weaving through the crowd with an agility Daniel couldn't match. He cursed under his breath and quickened his pace, his long legs eating up the ground. He was a man used to getting what he wanted. Nothing, no one, had ever outrun him before. But the girl was swift, and with every step she took, the distance between them grew smaller. "Stop!" Daniel shouted again, his voice rising above the din of the city. People parted to let him through, but the girl was already far ahead, a small figure in a sea of pedestrians. She turned into an alley, hoping to lose him in the maze of darkened passages. Daniel followed without hesitation, his anger propelling him forward. The alley was narrow and littered with trash, the air thick with the scent of decay. She stumbled, her foot catching on a stray bottle, and fell hard onto the ground. Daniel was nearly upon her now. He towered over the girl, his shadow falling across her trembling body. Her knee was scraped, and her hand was pressed against it in a futile attempt to stop the bleeding. She looked up at him, her eyes wide with fear and desperation. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I didn't mean to," Daniel sneered, his nostrils flaring in disgust. "You didn't mean to? You think that makes a difference? You think I'm just going to let you get away with this?" The girl trembled, trying to push herself up but failing. Daniel could see the raw terror in her eyes, the brokenness in her features. She was just a child, too young to be hardened by the cruel realities of life, yet here she was, a thief. He should have felt nothing but contempt. Instead, a flicker of something, regret, pity, stirred in his chest. But he was still angry. She had humiliated him, taken something that was his. "What's your name?" he demanded, his voice low and dangerous. "Emily," she said, her voice shaking. "Please, I didn't steal it for me. I need to." "Shut up," Daniel interrupted, kneeling down and grabbing her arm roughly. He yanked her to her feet. "You're going to jail for this." "No, please," Emily pleaded, her eyes wide with panic. "If I go to jail, who will take care of my mother?" The words hung in the air, heavy and unexpected. Daniel froze, his grip loosening slightly. The girl was not a hardened criminal, not a street urchin looking to survive at any cost. She was trying to protect someone. His mind raced, and for the first time in years, he felt an unfamiliar stir in his chest, something that resembled empathy. "Your mother?" he asked, his tone shifting. Emily nodded vigorously. "She's sick. I was trying to get medicine for her. She can't be alone. Please, I didn't want to steal. I had no choice." Daniel stood there, his mind whirling. The girl was a thief, but she wasn't what he had assumed her to be. And in that moment, for reasons he couldn't understand, he felt a strange pull, something beyond the money and power he'd spent a lifetime accumulating. Instead of dragging her to the police, he found himself saying something he never would have predicted. "Show me." What?" Emily stammered. "Show me where your mother is. I'll decide what to do next." Without waiting for her to protest, Daniel started walking toward the end of the alley, his mind already calculating his next move. The girl hesitated for only a moment before she followed. They walked in silence, Emily leading the way, her limp form small next to his towering presence. Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that something was changing, something he couldn't quite grasp. But one thing was certain. He wasn't done with this girl, and neither was he done with himself. And as the city hummed around them, Daniel Hawk, the ruthless billionaire, took his first steps into a world that had never mattered to him before. One that would challenge everything he thought he knew about life, compassion, and himself. The air grew colder as they walked, the bustling sounds of the city growing quieter with every step. Daniel's mind raced, his thoughts tangled in the strange pull of this situation. He wasn't a man accustomed to doubt, yet here he was, following a girl who had just stolen from him, stealing his attention, his curiosity, something he hadn't even realized he was missing. Emily led him through a series of narrow streets, her head down, her pace quickening as if she feared he might change his mind. Daniel's gaze remained fixed on her, studying her every movement. She was small, fragile even, her body hunched in an almost protective way, as though she carried more than just the weight of her own life. The faint scrape on her knee from her fall earlier seemed like a symbol of the life she was forced to endure, one that had no room for softness or tenderness. They turned a corner, and Daniel's eyes caught the flicker of neon lights in the distance. Another pharmacy, its sign glowing faintly in the early evening dusk. Emily's step faltered for a moment before she pushed forward, leading him to the entrance of the small store. She didn't look at him as she entered. She barely looked at anyone, her head lowered like a weary animal that had learned to survive by avoiding the world's gaze. Daniel watched her, feeling something churn in his gut. The girl had stolen from him, yet she was so much more than the petty thief he had assumed. There was a vulnerability about her, an openness that made his usual distrust of strangers seem so misguided. Inside, the pharmacy smelled of antiseptic and cheap medicines. Emily walked to the counter and began rifling through a small basket of goods, pulling out a package of antibiotics, a bottle of cough syrup, and a few other items, each of them costing far less than what Daniel had in his wallet. She approached the counter with her stolen money clutched tightly in her hands. The cashier eyed her with suspicion, but said nothing. Daniel stepped forward, his voice cutting through the silence like a sharp blade. "I'll pay for these." Emily froze, her eyes wide, caught off guard by his sudden appearance. The cashier raised an eyebrow, confused, but Daniel simply pulled out a few $100 bills from his pocket and laid them on the counter without another word. Emily opened her mouth to protest, but he silenced her with a glance, his jaw tight, his expression unreadable. "I said I'll pay for them. Take the medicine." There was something in his tone, something that wasn't a command, but more like an understanding, or perhaps a question. Emily, still shell-shocked, hesitated before she took the bag of medicine, her fingers trembling as she gripped it tightly. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely above a breath, as though she couldn't believe what was happening. Daniel didn't respond. Instead, he turned on his heel and motioned for her to follow. They walked out of the pharmacy in silence, the city's hum continuing around them, but for Daniel, it felt like they were in a world of their own. A strange, fragile bubble. "Where is she?" Daniel asked after a moment, his voice softer now, the anger from earlier dissipating into something more akin to concern. Emily didn't answer immediately. She glanced around, then led him further down the street to a narrow apartment building, its exterior worn and peeling, a far cry from the gleaming towers Daniel was used to. She stopped in front of the building, her shoulders slumping as if the weight of the world was pressing down on her. "This is where we live," she said quietly, but there was no pride in her voice, just a resigned acceptance of the life she had been given. They climbed a flight of creaky stairs, the walls thin and the air thick with the smell of mildew. As they reached the second floor, Emily paused in front of a door at the end of the hall, her hand trembling slightly as she turned the handle. The apartment inside was small and cramped, with barely enough room for two people. A single bed was pushed against the wall, its sheets messy, as if it had been slept in by someone who had little energy left for care. On the bed, an older woman lay unconscious, her face pale and drawn. She was emaciated, her skin sickly white, her chest rising and falling with shallow, labored breaths. "Mom," Emily called softly, her voice cracking as she knelt beside the bed. Laura didn't stir. Daniel felt a coldness settle in his chest as he watched the scene unfold. He had seen suffering before. He had seen poverty, illness, and loss. But seeing this young girl so devoted to a mother who could offer her little in return stirred something deep within him, something that made him question his entire life, the empire he had built, and the price at which it had come. He stood at the door, his mind working through the rapid shifts of emotion. This girl had stolen from him, yes, but she had stolen to save someone she loved. And that was something he understood, even if he had never known that kind of love himself. "Why didn't you tell me about her before?" Daniel's voice was hoarse as he spoke, his gaze never leaving Laura. I didn't know how," Emily replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "She's all I have. I don't want her to die." The words hit Daniel harder than he expected. He had never known a mother's love. Not like this. Not in the way Emily's eyes begged for her mother to wake up, for the woman who had raised her to hold on just a little longer. "Call an ambulance," he ordered, his tone firm, as if he were talking to one of his employees. But this was different. It wasn't about business. Emily didn't hesitate. She rushed to the phone, dialing with trembling fingers. Daniel watched as she spoke to the operator, explaining the situation, her voice thick with fear. He stepped closer, the weight of the moment pressing on him, but he didn't know what to say. He had never been good at comforting people, at offering warmth where it was needed most. As the ambulance arrived and paramedics rushed into the apartment, Daniel stayed at the door, his mind racing. He had come here for a wallet, and instead, he had found a life, a mother and daughter whose fate he now couldn't ignore. The sounds of sirens echoed in the small apartment as the paramedics worked swiftly, hooking Laura up to monitors and preparing her for transport. Emily stood at the side, her face pale and drawn, watching every movement with a mixture of hope and dread. She looked as though she might collapse any moment, but there was no time for weakness. She had to stay strong, for her mother, for herself. Daniel remained by the door, watching the chaos unfold with a detached calm that belied the turmoil beneath the surface. His mind, always calculating and strategic, was struggling to make sense of everything happening around him. He had never allowed emotions to cloud his judgment, never let anyone see him uncertain. But right now, something inside him was shifting, something raw and unexpected. "She's in critical condition," one of the paramedics said, looking over his shoulder as they lifted Laura onto a stretcher. "She needs urgent care, and the nearest hospital is—" "I'll take her to the best hospital," Daniel interrupted, his voice firm, cutting through the paramedic's words. The paramedic raised an eyebrow, clearly taken aback by Daniel's authority. But he didn't argue. Without another word, Daniel turned to Emily. She was standing in the corner, still shaking, her eyes focused on her mother, her lips trembling as she whispered to herself. "Come on," Daniel said, his tone softer now, almost hesitant. "We're going with her." Emily nodded, but didn't move at first. Her gaze was fixed on the paramedics as they worked to stabilize Laura. It was clear she wanted to be close to her mother, wanted to be the one making sure she was safe. But something held her back, perhaps the guilt of what had led them here, or maybe the fear that the future might hold nothing but more pain. "Emily," Daniel said gently, his voice more tender than he ever would have imagined it could be, "you need to come with us. Your mom needs you." That was enough. Emily finally turned, her legs unsteady as she walked to the door, her hand finding Daniel's sleeve in a silent plea for help. He didn't pull away. Instead, he placed his hand on her shoulder, steadying her, guiding her through the door and out into the night. The cool air hit them like a wall as they stepped outside, the bright lights of the city streets clashing with the dimness of the apartment. Daniel's car was parked just a few yards away, the sleek black exterior a stark contrast to the rundown surroundings. He opened the door for Emily, and she slid inside without a word, her eyes never leaving the flashing ambulance in front of them. "She'll be okay," Daniel said, though he wasn't entirely sure he believed it himself. Emily didn't respond. She stared straight ahead, her hands clenched tightly in her lap, as if holding on to something that might slip away if she let go. The ride to the hospital was silent. Daniel's mind was in turmoil. The girl, Emily, had stolen from him, but that was nothing compared to the depth of what was at stake now. He had tried to maintain control, to keep everything in his life neatly compartmentalized. But somehow, this situation had bypassed his defenses, breaking down walls he hadn't even known existed. By the time they arrived at the hospital, it was nearly midnight. The emergency room was bustling with activity, but when the paramedics arrived with Laura, everything seemed to shift. There was a flurry of nurses and doctors, all rushing to prepare her for immediate surgery, but one thing was clear. Her chances were slim. "They're taking her into surgery," one of the nurses informed them, her face tight with concern. "She's not stable, and we'll need to operate immediately to try and save her." Emily clutched the side of the bed, her face pale but determined. Daniel stood a few feet away, watching her with something like guilt gnawing at him. He had never been one to show vulnerability, but in this moment, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had been pulled into something much bigger than himself. "How much will it cost?" he asked, his voice devoid of emotion. The nurse hesitated for a moment before answering. "It's not a matter of money right now," she said softly. "It's a matter of whether or not we can save her." Daniel's jaw clenched. Money had always been his answer to problems. He had built his empire on that very principle. If you had enough, you could buy anything. But this was beyond money. It wasn't about the best surgeon or the fastest medical equipment. It was about a life, someone's mother, someone's world. But Daniel wasn't someone who backed down from challenges. He wasn't someone who walked away when things got difficult. "I'll cover the costs," he said, his voice firm, more certain than ever. "Do what you need to do. Save her life." The nurse gave him a quick nod before disappearing into the surgery room, and Emily, looking overwhelmed, turned to face him. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, her voice cracking. "You don't owe us anything." Daniel paused, his gaze shifting to the floor for a moment, then back to Emily. For the first time in his life, he was unsure of the answer. He could have walked away. He could have left her to her fate, walked out of that hospital, and never looked back. But something in him had changed. Maybe it was the desperate way Emily had looked at him when she had asked him to help her mother. Maybe it was the raw emotion in her voice when she had spoken about her mother, about their struggles. Or maybe, just maybe, it was because for once, he had seen something worth fighting for beyond his wealth, beyond his empire. "I don't know," Daniel said honestly, his voice quieter now, "but I can't walk away." And for the first time in a long time, Daniel Hawk, the man who had built everything on power, control, and money, found himself face to face with something he couldn't buy, couldn't fix with a checkbook. But he could try. Emily didn't say anything. She just stared at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of disbelief and something else. Maybe gratitude, maybe hope. As the door to the surgery room closed behind them, Daniel realized that the world he had built, the one he had carefully crafted over decades, was about to crumble. And for the first time, he felt ready to face it, ready to confront the uncertainty of a world where the rules weren't written in money, but in something much more fragile, human connection. The minutes felt like hours as Daniel and Emily waited in the sterile white hallway, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead like an incessant reminder of the time ticking away. The hospital was eerily quiet except for the occasional footsteps of nurses rushing past, their faces tense as they moved with purpose. Daniel sat in the uncomfortable plastic chair, his mind racing as he tried to process everything that had happened in the last few hours. Emily was pacing back and forth, her hands ringing in anxious circles. Every few moments, she would stop to glance at the door to the surgery room, as though willing it to open. Her eyes were hollow with worry, her lips pressed tight, but there was a fire in her gaze, a fire fueled by the desire to save her mother. Daniel couldn't ignore the silent desperation in her movements. He hadn't known her long, but already, he could see the bond between them. It was the kind of bond that made no room for weakness, only strength, only survival. He had seen many things in his life: wealth, power, greed, and ambition. But this was different. This wasn't about winning or losing. This was about a mother's life hanging by a thread, and a daughter who would do anything to keep that thread from snapping. After what felt like an eternity, the door to the surgery room finally swung open, and a surgeon emerged, wiping his hands on a blood-stained apron. His face was grim, his expression unreadable as he walked toward them. "Is she?" Emily whispered, her voice cracking. The surgeon held up a hand, motioning for them to stay quiet. He looked at Daniel, his eyes sharp, assessing him as if trying to measure whether he was the type of person who would understand the weight of his words. "She's stable for now," the surgeon said, his voice low but steady. "The surgery was a success, but her condition is still critical. We've done everything we can, but it's up to her body now. We'll need to monitor her closely." Emily's breath hitched as she clutched the sides of her coat. "You mean she's not out of danger yet?" The surgeon nodded, his face softened by the exhaustion of hours spent trying to save a life. "I'm afraid not. But we've done all we can at this point. All we can do is wait." A heavy silence fell between them. Emily's shoulders slumped as she absorbed the weight of the surgeon's words, her face pale with the effort of holding back her tears. Daniel watched her, a part of him aching to offer comfort, but not knowing how. He had never been good at this, never been the one to offer solace in moments of crisis. It wasn't part of the world he had lived in, the world where everything was transactional, everything had a price. But this was something different. He stood up slowly, moving toward her with a deliberate calm. "She'll pull through," he said, his voice firm, though there was a crack in it, betraying the uncertainty he felt deep inside. "You're strong, Emily, and your mom is stronger than you think." She didn't look up at him. Her eyes remained fixed on the floor, as if avoiding the weight of his gaze. But she nodded slightly, a small movement, as though she was trying to hold onto the fragile thread of hope he was offering. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Thank you for everything. For being here." Daniel's chest tightened at the sincerity in her voice. He wasn't used to being thanked for anything. In his world, people did what was expected of them, and in return, they received compensation. But here, with Emily, it wasn't about what he could buy or give her. It was about presence, about being there in the most painful moments of her life. A few moments later, the surgeon returned, his expression softer now, as if he had come to offer a glimmer of hope. "There's a bed open in the ICU," he said. "We'll need to transfer her there for continuous monitoring. It's the best we can do for now." Emily nodded quickly, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. She didn't say anything, but the gratitude in her eyes was unmistakable. As the medical staff moved Laura onto the gurney and wheeled her toward the ICU, Daniel stayed close behind Emily, his presence an unspoken promise to see this through. They were led down another corridor, deeper into the heart of the hospital. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, the antiseptic smell growing more pungent with each step. Emily walked with purpose now, her pace quickening as they approached the ICU. She was focused, determined, like someone who had been in this kind of situation before. The strength she had shown in the face of everything, her fear, her uncertainty, was a quiet kind of power. At the ICU, they were led to a private room where Laura was hooked up to several machines. The steady beep of the heart monitor filled the room, a stark reminder of the fragility of life. Emily stood beside her mother's bed, her fingers gently brushing against the older woman's hand, her expression a mixture of longing and fear. She was here, but not really here. The woman she had known, strong, protective, was gone. All that was left was this fragile body, tethered to life by machines. Daniel lingered in the doorway, watching from a distance. He wasn't sure what he had expected. In a strange way, he had thought that after everything, things would fall into place, as if the universe would reward his actions with some kind of certainty. But life, it seemed, wasn't that simple. "She's not going to make it, is she?" Emily's voice was barely above a whisper, but Daniel heard the crack in it, the admission of fear she had been holding back for so long. Daniel hesitated, unsure of what to say. He had never faced a situation like this, never had to comfort someone in the face of such dire uncertainty. But in that moment, he realized that no amount of wealth, no number of successful business deals, could change the truth. They were all just human, all just fighting for something bigger than themselves. He took a deep breath, then walked into the room, standing next to Emily. His hand, almost instinctively, found her shoulder, a small gesture that somehow seemed to convey more than words ever could. "I don't know what will happen," he said quietly, "but I'm not going anywhere. I'll be here. You're not alone in this." Emily didn't respond, but she leaned into his touch, her head resting on his shoulder for just a moment. In that fragile silence, Daniel felt the weight of his words settle between them. A promise, a hope, a shared understanding that the world they both lived in had just been altered, irrevocably, by the simple act of human connection. And for the first time in a long time, Daniel felt something he hadn't known he had been missing: hope. The hours stretched into the night, and the sterile white walls of the ICU room seemed to grow colder with each passing minute. Daniel remained at Emily's side, watching her hover close to her mother's bed, her eyes locked on the slow, rhythmic beep of the heart monitor. The contrast between Emily's anxious, pale face and Laura's motionless form was striking. Laura's life was hanging in the balance, and yet, all around them, the world seemed to move on, indifferent, untouched. Daniel had grown used to the hum of his own controlled existence. He was a man who could make anything happen: money, success, power. But this was beyond his understanding. He couldn't buy a miracle, couldn't negotiate his way out of the uncertainty they were trapped in. There was no formula, no equation that could promise an outcome. "Thank you," Emily whispered again, her voice soft but filled with an emotion Daniel wasn't quite used to receiving. She hadn't asked for his help, hadn't even known she needed it, but somehow, here he was, standing in the middle of this unfamiliar world of hospitals, pain, and loss, offering something he had never given anyone: his presence. "It's the least I can do," Daniel said, his voice rough with something he couldn't quite place. He faltered, realizing how much had shifted in him since this entire ordeal had started. "I wasn't expecting any of this." Emily's gaze flickered to his face, her eyes catching the vulnerability he rarely allowed to show. She didn't say anything, but she gave him a small nod, the kind of nod that spoke volumes, of understanding, of gratitude, and perhaps of an unspoken recognition that both their lives were in a state of transformation. Just then, the door to the ICU room opened, and a police officer stepped inside, his uniform neat and official, but his presence like a cold breeze cutting through the warmth of the moment. "Ms. Emerson," the officer said, his voice firm but not unkind, "I need to speak with you for a moment." Emily tensed, her hand tightening around the side of her mother's bed. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice sharp, a flicker of fear flashing in her eyes. "I'm afraid we have a warrant for your arrest," the officer continued, his words seemingly cutting through the fragile peace of the room. "There have been reports of thefts, and we need to take you in for questioning." The words felt like a slap in the face. Emily's entire body went rigid, her breath catching in her throat. Her eyes darted to Daniel, a silent plea for help reflected in them, but Daniel felt as though the air had been sucked out of the room. This wasn't supposed to happen. Not now, not when everything else was on the brink of collapse. He had hoped, no, he had believed that the worst of it was behind them. But fate had other plans. "Wait," Daniel interjected, his voice low but unwavering as he stepped forward. "You can't take her now. Her mother is in critical condition. We're in the middle of trying to save her life. This isn't the time for this." The officer looked at Daniel, his expression unreadable. "Sir, I understand the situation, but the warrant is clear. She's involved in multiple thefts." "I don't care about your warrants," Daniel said, cutting him off, his voice hardening with a resolve that was almost foreign to him. "She's not going anywhere." Emily stood frozen, caught between the officer's demands and Daniel's insistence. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. What could she say? The weight of her actions hung over her like a shadow, an unspoken truth she had been carrying for too long. She had stolen, had taken from people like Daniel, the rich, the powerful, just to survive. It was wrong. She knew it was wrong. But in that moment, with her mother in a coma, the need for survival had outweighed everything else. The officer hesitated for a moment, clearly caught off guard by Daniel's forceful defense. He looked at Emily, then back at Daniel. "You can't protect her from the law, sir," the officer said, his tone firm but respectful. "She has a history." "She's not going anywhere," Daniel repeated, his voice colder now, filled with a quiet authority that made the officer take a step back. "Not while her mother is fighting for her life." There was a long, tense pause before the officer finally gave a slight nod, his expression still cautious. "This doesn't mean you're off the hook, Miss Emerson. We'll be in touch." With that, he turned and left, his footsteps echoing down the hallway, leaving a silence in his wake that felt like a heavy weight pressing down on all of them. Emily slowly sank back into the chair beside her mother's bed, her face pale with the sudden rush of fear and disbelief. Her hands were trembling, but she didn't seem to notice. I didn't think they'd come here," she whispered, almost to herself. Daniel remained standing, watching her, trying to process everything that had just unfolded. He had always believed that life was about control, about making sure that nothing, no one, could derail your plans. But today, his life had spiraled in a direction he hadn't expected. He wasn't a man who had ever been at the mercy of another's fate. But here, with Emily, here, in this raw moment, he was. "You're not alone in this," Daniel said quietly, his voice softer now, more certain than before. He took a step forward, standing beside Emily. "You've got me. You're not facing this alone." Emily turned to him then, her eyes wide with a mix of shock and something else, perhaps disbelief, perhaps even a little bit of hope. She had never expected this from him, never expected him to stand by her in a moment like this. "I don't even know what to say," she whispered, her voice trembling. "You've already done so much." "I haven't done anything yet," Daniel replied, his voice firm. "But I will. We'll figure this out. Together." It was the first time Emily had heard someone say that to her. And though she wasn't sure what tomorrow would bring, what would happen with her mother, what would happen with the law, what would happen with everything that had come crashing into her life, she knew one thing for certain. For the first time in a long time, she wasn't completely alone. And that, for now, was enough. Outside the sterile hospital walls, the night carried on as usual, unchanged, indifferent to the lives inside. But in the small ICU room, something had shifted. Daniel had stepped into a world he had long avoided, and in doing so, had unknowingly changed the trajectory of both their lives. What came next? Neither of them knew. But for the first time in a long time, they weren't running from it. They were facing it, together. The hours dragged on with a sluggish relentlessness, each passing minute heavier than the last. The fluorescent lights in the ICU room hummed a constant, almost oppressive rhythm, their sterile glow doing nothing to lighten the air that felt thick with anxiety. Emily sat beside her mother's bed, eyes fixed on Laura's still form, her fingers gently brushing over the older woman's hand, willing it to move, to stir. But there was nothing, no response. Daniel had stepped back, allowing Emily the space she needed. He couldn't fathom what she was feeling, how she was holding on, trying to keep herself together in the face of a reality that seemed to slip further from her grasp. But he understood the power of a moment, the power of not being alone. He had never needed anyone before, not like this, but he knew Emily did. And for whatever reason, maybe because of what he saw in her strength, in her quiet desperation, he stayed. After what felt like an eternity, a nurse stepped into the room, her soft footsteps barely making a sound on the floor. She was young, her face kind but weary, as though she too had been worn down by the weight of the hospital's ceaseless demands. "How is she?" Emily asked, her voice hoarse but filled with hope, the kind of fragile hope that only the desperate can carry. The nurse gave a small smile, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Her condition is still critical. The surgery was successful, but there's no telling yet how she'll respond. We've done all we can for now. The next few hours will be crucial." Emily nodded, her lips pressed tight together as if she were fighting to keep herself from breaking down. She couldn't. Not now. Not when her mother needed her more than ever. Daniel stepped closer to the bed, his mind a whirlwind of thoughts. How had he ended up here? In this cold, sterile hospital room, surrounded by pain, uncertainty, and fear? How had he become someone who stayed, someone who fought for others in ways he never thought possible? The man who had built his life on wealth, on power. None of that mattered here. In this moment, there was no money, no business deal that could fix this. There was only Laura, unconscious, teetering between life and death, and Emily, who was holding on with everything she had, even though it felt like the universe was slowly pulling her apart. "I've arranged for the best surgeon to be on standby," Daniel said, his voice steady. He didn't know where this conviction had come from, but it was there, strong, unwavering. "I'm not going to let anything happen to her. We'll make sure she gets the care she needs." Emily glanced up at him, her eyes swollen from the tears she hadn't let fall in front of him. "You don't have to do this, Daniel. You've already done so much." Her voice faltered, but she pressed on, her gaze unwavering as she looked at him. "I don't even know what to say." "You don't need to say anything," he replied, his voice quiet but certain. "I'm not doing this for you or for your mom. I'm doing it because it's the right thing to do, and because I promised I wouldn't leave." For a long moment, Emily stared at him, as though weighing his words, as though trying to understand the man standing in front of her. He wasn't the same man who had walked into her life only days ago. A stranger, indifferent to the suffering of others, focused only on himself. No, this was someone different. Someone who, perhaps, had started to realize that life wasn't about control or success or power. It was about something else, something bigger. "Thank you," Emily whispered, the words barely a breath. She didn't know how to express the gratitude that swelled inside her, gratitude for his presence, for the way he was standing beside her now, a steady anchor in the storm. Before Daniel could respond, the room's door opened again, and a new face entered. An older man, his expression serious but kind. He was wearing a white coat, his stethoscope draped around his neck, his steps deliberate as he made his way toward them. "I'm Dr. Sinclair," he introduced himself, his voice calm, but carrying an air of authority. "I've been briefed on Mrs. Emerson's case. I understand the situation is delicate." Emily stood immediately, her heart pounding in her chest. She had heard of Dr. Sinclair. He was one of the best in the field, renowned for his expertise. And yet, the nervous flutter in her stomach told her that no matter how skilled a surgeon might be, there were no guarantees. "How is she?" Emily asked, her voice trembling. "Is there anything else we can do?" Dr. Sinclair looked at her with an expression that was both compassionate and pragmatic. "Right now, the most important thing is that we wait. Her condition is critical, but she's stable for the time being. I've reviewed her charts, and I can see that there's a treatment plan in place. But we're facing a tough road ahead. The next 24 hours will determine everything." Daniel stepped forward, his brow furrowed with concern. "Is there any way to speed up the process? Anything that can be done right now?" Dr. Sinclair paused for a moment, clearly weighing his words. "We have resources. We can use the best technology and the most experienced staff. But miracles don't happen just because we want them. Sometimes, the body needs time. And sometimes, well, sometimes it doesn't respond the way we hope." The doctor's words hung in the air like a cold draft, and Emily's heart sank. She had never expected easy answers, but this reality was something she hadn't been prepared for. It felt like every hope she'd built up was crumbling into dust, leaving her standing in the ruins of her own fears. "Is there any way?" She started, then stopped, unsure of what she was even asking. "Is there anything we can do to make sure she has the best chance?" Dr. Sinclair met her eyes, his expression gentle but firm. "You've done all you can by being here. Now, we need to focus on keeping her as comfortable as possible. And hope for the best." Hope. The word echoed in the silence of the room. Emily felt a lump form in her throat as she returned her gaze to her mother, willing her to wake, to show some sign of life. But there was nothing, only the steady rhythm of the machines, the mechanical beeping that felt almost alien in the face of everything that truly mattered. And in that moment, Emily realized something. Hope wasn't just about wishing for the best outcome. It was about enduring, about staying, about refusing to give up when the world seemed to be crumbling around you. She had already done that. She had been fighting for her mother, for herself, for so long. But now, it was time to let others help. And for the first time in a long while, she realized she didn't have to carry the burden alone. Daniel's presence, though quiet, felt like an anchor. She could feel his resolve, the unspoken promise that he wasn't going anywhere. And for the first time, as she sat beside her mother, she allowed herself to believe, if only for a moment, that maybe, just maybe, things would be okay. Because in the midst of all this despair, there was still hope. And hope was the one thing she could cling to. The next few hours felt like a lifetime. The sterile buzz of machines and the cold, lifeless walls of the hospital room became a constant backdrop to Emily's thoughts, which swirled with fear, uncertainty, and a deep, gnawing helplessness. Despite the promise Daniel had made, despite the presence of Dr. Sinclair and the best medical technology available, she couldn't escape the overwhelming sense that she was losing her mother, that every second that passed brought her mother closer to slipping beyond her reach. Her mother, the woman who had always been her protector, her source of strength, now lay motionless in that bed, struggling for breath. Emily's hand never left her mother's, her fingers gripping it tightly as if that alone could anchor her to the reality she desperately wished for. But there were no guarantees, no assurances that this nightmare would end in anything other than loss. Daniel had stepped outside a while ago, giving Emily some space. She wasn't sure if it was for her benefit or his, but when he returned, he had that same calm determination that seemed to cut through her storm of emotions. He stood at the door for a moment, just watching her, before stepping in and sitting down in the chair beside the bed. "I spoke with the head of the hospital," he said, his voice a quiet anchor in the tension-filled room. "They're doing everything they can. The treatment plan is in place, and the surgeon is on call for anything that might happen." Emily didn't respond immediately. She couldn't. Her eyes were fixed on her mother, whose shallow breathing seemed to echo through the room with a constant reminder of the danger they were in. She felt as though her world was tilting on the edge of an abyss, and all she could do was hold on and hope it didn't break beneath her. Daniel studied her for a moment, noting the way her body seemed to sag under the weight of it all. The woman who had been so strong, so fierce in her determination to protect her mother, was now a shell of herself, her face pale, her hands trembling. "I know it's hard," Daniel said softly, though the words didn't seem to ease the heavy silence that hung between them. "But you've done everything you can. Now it's up to the doctors. It's up to her to fight." Emily's head snapped up at the words. She met his gaze, and for the first time since they'd arrived, she truly saw him. Not the man who had come to her rescue, or the wealthy, detached businessman who had barged into her life. No, this was something different. This was a man who understood what it meant to struggle, to face something that was beyond his control, to be a witness to suffering and still try to make it better. "I'm scared," she confessed, her voice barely above a whisper. She hadn't realized how tightly she'd been holding everything inside until that moment. Her emotions, her fears, they all rushed out like a floodgate being released. "What if she doesn't make it? What if I lose her?" Daniel leaned forward slightly, his gaze unwavering. He didn't try to offer platitudes or empty promises. He didn't tell her everything would be fine. Instead, he simply nodded. "I'm not going to lie to you, Emily. I don't know what will happen. No one does. But what I do know is that you're not alone. I'm not going anywhere." It was the first time since they'd met that Emily truly believed him. For a long time, there was silence again. The machines continued their monotonous beeping in the background, a constant reminder of the fight that was taking place in her mother's body. But this time, it wasn't an oppressive silence. It was a quiet understanding, an acknowledgement that they didn't need words to be there for each other. Emily had never expected this from Daniel. She had never thought she would find someone like him in the midst of all her chaos. But here he was, steady and present, offering a stability she had desperately needed without ever knowing it. And then, as if the universe had decided that there had been enough waiting, enough wondering, the moment arrived. A sharp change in the rhythm of the heart monitor broke the fragile peace. The steady beep had begun to fluctuate, quickening. Emily's heart leapt in her chest as she jerked her head toward the monitor, her breath catching in her throat. "Doctor!" she cried, her voice panic-stricken. Daniel was already on his feet, rushing toward the door. "I'll get the doctor," he said, his voice commanding despite the fear creeping into his expression. "Don't worry. They're prepared for this." Emily's pulse pounded in her ears as she stayed beside her mother, watching as the beeping grew erratic, the monitor flashing urgent red. For a moment, everything seemed to stretch into a blur. She reached out to her mother's hand, pressing it between her own with a desperate, almost frantic force. "Mom, please. Fight. Please. Don't leave me." And then, as if in response to her plea, the room exploded into motion. The door burst open, and Dr. Sinclair and a team of nurses flooded in, quickly surrounding the bed. Emily was pushed back slightly, her hands slipping from her mother's, but she couldn't tear her eyes away. She couldn't let herself look away from this moment, this fight that felt like it could determine everything. "Give her room." Dr. Sinclair barked as he moved to Laura's side, assessing the situation quickly. "We need to stabilize her. Get the medication in now." Emily's chest tightened as she stood back, her hands clutching at her sides, her heart beating loudly in her throat. The room felt suffocating, the air thick with tension and fear. Minutes stretched like hours. Emily could hear her breath, shallow and quick, the sound of her own pulse in her ears. And then, just as quickly as the crisis had begun, it started to subside. The beeping slowed. The nurses continued their work, but the tension in the air eased just a little. "Her heart rate is stabilizing, Dr. Sinclair said, his voice still calm but with a note of relief. "We've got her back under control." Emily let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. She felt dizzy with exhaustion, her legs threatening to give way beneath her, but she didn't care. Her mother was still alive. For now, that was enough. Daniel stepped forward again, his eyes scanning the room. "Is she going to be okay?" Dr. Sinclair didn't offer false assurances, but he gave a small nod. "She's not out of the woods yet, but we've bought her more time. Now we wait." Emily sank back into her chair, her hand once again finding her mother's. She closed her eyes for a moment, allowing herself a small, fleeting sigh of relief. It wasn't over, but they had won the battle. For now, and that was enough. The next few days were a blur of tests, consultations, and late-night vigils. Every time Emily looked up, she saw Daniel's steady presence by her side, offering support when she needed it, remaining silent when words weren't enough. She had never imagined she would come to rely on him so much, never expected that someone like him would be there when it counted most. But sometimes, life had a way of surprising you. And in the middle of the most difficult moments, she had found someone who cared, someone who wasn't afraid to fight alongside her. And somewhere deep inside, Emily knew that whatever happened, she would never be the same again. The days blurred together in a haze of waiting, hospital room visits, and the steady rhythm of beeping monitors. Each time Emily stepped into the sterile, whitewashed room, she braced herself for the worst, but she refused to accept it. Not yet. Not when her mother's life still hung in the balance. Samantha had remained unconscious, her body fragile and fighting for each breath. Despite the medication and the steady vigilance of the medical staff, it was clear that the road to recovery would be long. But Emily had no choice but to hold on to hope. She clung to it the way a drowning person might cling to a lifeline, even when the odds seemed insurmountable. Daniel had been a constant presence, his quiet strength giving Emily a solid anchor. He didn't offer empty promises or false hope. Instead, he remained by her side, waiting alongside her, enduring the same uncertainty. And, in moments when Emily felt herself breaking, when the weight of the situation became too much to bear, Daniel's calm reassurance was the only thing that steadied her. Today, as Emily entered the hospital room, the air seemed different. It wasn't the sterile, impersonal air of the previous days, but something heavier, charged with expectation. The nurses moved with purpose, their eyes flicking to the door every few moments, as though waiting for something or someone. Emily noticed it too, the shift in the atmosphere that told her something was about to change. She approached her mother's bed, her heart racing with a mix of fear and hope. Samantha's chest rose and fell with labored breaths, her face pale and drawn. But there was something in her mother's features now, something Emily hadn't seen before. A faint flicker of life. Her fingers twitched slightly, and her eyelids fluttered ever so gently. Emily's breath caught in her throat. Is this it? Could her mother finally be waking up? Mom, Emily whispered, her voice cracking as she gently placed her hand on Samantha's. Please, Mom, if you can hear me, just open your eyes. Come back to me. For a moment, nothing happened. The room felt still, like the calm before the storm. Emily's hope wavered, but she refused to let it die. Then, as if in answer to her plea, Samantha's eyes slowly opened. It wasn't a dramatic awakening. It wasn't the grand moment Emily had imagined in her dreams. But it was enough. Her mother's eyes flickered with recognition, her pupils dilating slowly as she took in her surroundings. Emily held her breath, afraid to move, afraid to disturb the fragile moment. Mom, Emily whispered again, her voice trembling with emotion. Samantha's lips parted, but no sound came out. Instead, her gaze locked onto Emily's, a slow, hesitant smile tugging at her lips. It was weak, but it was there, a sign of life, of hope. Emily. Samantha's voice was a hoarse whisper, raw and fragile. I'm sorry. Shh, don't talk, Emily urged gently, her eyes brimming with tears. You're going to be okay. We're going to get through this. Just take it easy. But her mother shook her head slightly, as though trying to communicate something important, something she needed to say. I'm so sorry for everything, Samantha murmured, her voice barely audible, her eyes filled with an emotion that broke Emily's heart. I never meant to hurt you. Emily's heart ached as she saw the deep regret in her mother's eyes. It was the first time Samantha had expressed any guilt, any recognition of the strain their lives had suffered over the years. Emily had always known her mother was strong, independent. But this weakness, this vulnerability, was something new. And it was something Emily had never expected. Mom, you don't need to apologize, Emily whispered, brushing a tear from her own cheek. We're in this together, okay? Just rest now. Don't worry about anything else. Samantha's gaze softened, but she seemed to drift again, her eyes fluttering shut. The tension in the room lifted slightly, but it remained, like an unspoken promise that the worst wasn't over, that there were still battles to be fought. But for now, at least, Emily could breathe. As Emily sat quietly beside her mother's bed, a gentle knock interrupted the moment. Daniel stepped in, his expression unreadable but kind. He had been just outside, waiting for this exact moment. How is she? He asked quietly, walking closer to the bed. She's awake, Emily said, her voice thick with emotion. She's still here. Daniel smiled, a rare and genuine smile, his relief palpable. That's a miracle. Emily nodded slowly, her heart swelling with gratitude. But she couldn't forget the seriousness of the situation. They had won this battle, but the war was far from over. Her mother's recovery was still uncertain, and there were so many unknowns. But for the first time in days, Emily allowed herself to feel something other than fear. She allowed herself to feel hope. Daniel pulled a chair over to the bedside and sat beside Emily. He didn't say anything for a long moment, just watching Samantha sleep, her breathing still uneven but steady. After a long silence, Daniel spoke again, his voice quiet and reflective. You know, I never thought I'd find myself here. I've lived my life thinking that the only thing that mattered was money, success, power, control. But I've learned something these past few days. It's not about any of that. It's about people. It's about the ones you care about. It's about being there when it matters. Emily turned to him, her eyes softening. She hadn't expected this kind of reflection from him. She had never expected anything from him, really. And yet, here he was, offering his presence, his support, without asking for anything in return. It was something that she would never have imagined, and it touched her in a way that words couldn't fully express. I think you're right, she said softly, the weight of his words sinking in. You don't realize what really matters until everything else falls away. Until the only thing left is the people who love you and need you. Daniel's gaze flicked to her, his eyes serious. And you've got more people than you think who care about you, Emily. I'll be here, no matter what happens next. Her heart swelled with a quiet gratitude, but before she could speak, the door opened once more. A nurse stepped in with a smile, carrying a tray with medication for Samantha. Emily stood up, stepping aside so the nurse could do her job, but she couldn't help but glance back at Daniel, the words unsaid but understood between them. This was the beginning of something different, something new. No longer was Emily alone in this fight. She had someone by her side, someone who had proven himself in ways she never could have imagined. And for the first time since her mother's collapse, Emily believed in the possibility of a better tomorrow. Even if the road was still long and the future uncertain, she knew they could face it together. Hope, she realized, wasn't a miracle. It was something you built, piece by piece, with the people you loved. And maybe, just maybe, she could start to believe in miracles again. The days that followed Samantha's miraculous awakening were a roller coaster of emotions. Each new development seemed to carry the weight of the world, each step forward shadowed by the lingering fear of setbacks. Samantha's condition fluctuated. At times her heart rate would stabilize, her breathing becoming less labored, but other times, the beeping machines would remind them all just how fragile the situation remained. Emily spent each day at her mother's side, never straying too far, always waiting for the next sign that the worst was over. Daniel, as usual, remained steadfast, an ever-present source of support. He had hired the best specialists, secured the most advanced treatments, and even brought in a consultant from overseas to make sure they were covering every possible option. But as much as Emily appreciated his efforts, she couldn't shake the feeling that no matter how much money, how many resources they poured into this, nothing could guarantee that her mother would survive. But on the morning of the fourth day after Samantha's surgery, something changed. Emily woke to the sounds of frantic footsteps outside her room, the hospital staff moving quickly, a sense of urgency that immediately sent a chill through her spine. Her stomach twisted with fear as she rushed out into the corridor, looking for answers. The nurse who greeted her had the same neutral expression she always wore, but today, there was something else, something in her eyes. "Miss Stevens," she said quietly, her voice steady but strained, "you need to come with me. Your mother's condition has worsened." The air in Emily's lungs seemed to vanish as she followed the nurse back to her mother's room, her heart hammering in her chest. Every step felt like it took her further into an abyss she wasn't ready to face. When she entered the room, the sight that greeted her sent a shockwave of panic through her. Samantha's body was tense, her heart rate erratic, her skin unnaturally pale. A team of doctors surrounded her, working frantically to stabilize her. The machines beeped, their pace quickening with each passing second, signaling the rising danger. Emily barely registered Daniel's presence beside her, his hand gripping hers with surprising force, his jaw clenched. They both stood frozen for a moment, watching as the doctors fought to save Samantha, their voices a blur of commands and instructions. "Get the defibrillator," someone shouted. Emily felt her knees threaten to buckle, but Daniel's grip on her hand tightened, holding her steady. He didn't say anything, but his presence was a silent promise. "You're not alone." She could barely breathe as the doctors worked, the time stretching out like an eternity. Every second felt like a battle, a race against time, and the uncertainty of the outcome hung heavy in the air. Minutes passed before the chaos began to subside, the frantic voices lowering into tense silence. Dr. Sinclair, who had been leading the team, stepped back from Samantha's bed, wiping his brow with the back of his hand. His face was serious, but not defeated. "Her heart rate is stabilizing," he said, his voice calm, though laced with exhaustion. "We've managed to bring her back. For now, at least." Emily let out a breath she didn't realize she had been holding, and she collapsed into the nearest chair, her legs giving way. Daniel, who had remained standing, gave her hand a reassuring squeeze, his eyes never leaving Samantha's unconscious form. "We're not out of the woods yet," Dr. Sinclair added, glancing at Emily. but she's made it through the worst of it. We'll continue to monitor her closely." Emily nodded numbly, still trying to process everything that had just happened. Her mind was spinning, and the weight of it all seemed to crash down on her. She had been on the verge of losing her mother, again. And yet, somehow, against all odds, Samantha had held on. "We'll be here," Daniel said quietly, his voice steady. "No matter what happens, we're not going anywhere." Emily could only nod, her throat tight. She didn't know what to say. Her emotions were raw, a mixture of relief and dread, of exhaustion and disbelief. She was emotionally drained, but there was still a part of her that couldn't let go of the fear. Every moment she spent in this hospital room was a reminder that nothing was certain, nothing was guaranteed. For hours, they watched over Samantha, each minute stretching longer than the last. The nurses continued to monitor her, checking her vitals, adjusting her medication, but the heavy silence between Emily and Daniel was almost unbearable. They didn't need to speak. It was as if they were both waiting for something, waiting for the other shoe to drop, for the world to shift under their feet again. But as the hours passed, a quiet hope began to bloom, fragile yet undeniable. By evening, Samantha's condition had stabilized enough that Emily was allowed to sit by her side again. She gently took her mother's hand, feeling the slight warmth of her skin against her own. It was a small comfort, but it was something. She looked over at Daniel, who had seated himself in the corner of the room, his eyes fixed on the floor. For the first time in days, he seemed to be the one who was weary. The exhaustion had caught up with him, the weight of the situation pressing on his shoulders. Emily felt a flicker of something inside her, a deep, quiet gratitude for this man who had been so much more than a stranger to her in the past week. He had given so much without asking for anything in return. He had stood by her side in the darkest moments, his presence unwavering. And though they hadn't said it out loud, Emily realized she could trust him. The quiet between them stretched on until, finally, Daniel spoke, his voice soft. "She's a fighter. Your mother. Just like you." Emily's throat tightened at his words. She wanted to believe it. She wanted to believe that Samantha would be okay. But there was still a part of her that couldn't let go of the fear. She had seen so much darkness in the past few days, so many close calls. But for now, at least there was hope. And that was all she could ask for. "Thank you," Emily whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "For everything." Daniel met her gaze, his expression unreadable but soft. "It's not over yet, Emily, but we're in this together." And for the first time in days, Emily allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, everything would be okay. That the fight wasn't over, but there was still a chance. There was still hope. The days that followed the crisis were marked by a quiet vigilance. Samantha's condition had stabilized, but the path to her full recovery was uncertain. Emily remained by her mother's side, her every moment consumed with worry, but also with a growing sense of gratitude for the miracle they had witnessed. Samantha's faint but steady breathing became the rhythm of her life, and every sign of progress, however small, felt like a victory. But it wasn't just her mother's recovery that kept Emily on edge. It was the overwhelming sense of uncertainty that clung to them all. Samantha was awake, but she wasn't fully present yet. Her words were few, her mind still hazy from the trauma, and Emily couldn't help but wonder. What if she never truly returns to herself? It was a question she couldn't ask aloud. Not when there was still a chance. Not when there was still hope. One evening, as the sun dipped low and cast long shadows over the hospital room, Emily found herself lost in thought, staring out the window. She had just taken a brief break to get some fresh air, but the cool breeze didn't seem to offer any relief. Her mind was still spinning, trapped in a cycle of worry and doubt. She had been here so long, and she couldn't remember what it was like to feel normal, to breathe without the weight of the world on her chest. Daniel had been a constant source of stability, but she didn't want to lean on him too much. He had already done so much for them. He had given everything, and Emily couldn't help but feel like she was taking too much, taking him for granted. She didn't want to be a burden. "Emily?" The soft voice cut through her thoughts, and she turned quickly. Samantha's gaze was focused on her, her eyes slightly more alert than they had been in days. There was something different about her, something brighter. A spark of recognition. Mom! Emily's heart leapt in her chest, and she rushed to her side. You're awake. You're really awake. Samantha's lips curled into a weak, but genuine, smile. Her voice was still raspy, and it wavered slightly as she spoke. I'm here, I think. Just still trying to catch up. Emily took her mother's hand. Her eyes filled with unshed tears. You're doing great, Mom. Don't try to talk too much. Just rest. But Samantha shook her head gently, her hand tightening around Emily's. No, I need to say something important. Emily's brow furrowed with concern. What is it, Mom? What's wrong? Samantha took a deep, labored breath, and her gaze seemed to focus on some distant memory. I know I've let you down, Emily. So many times. You don't deserve what I put you through. Emily's heart tightened at the words. She had heard the guilt in her mother's voice before, but this was different. This wasn't just an apology. It was an acknowledgement of everything Samantha had done wrong. All the years of struggle, all the mistakes, all the pain. Mom, Emily whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. Please, you don't have to apologize. You don't have to say anything. We've been through enough. But Samantha wasn't done. Her grip on Emily's hand tightened, as if she needed to make sure her daughter understood. I need you to know that I'm sorry. For everything. For the times I wasn't there for you. For the times I pushed you away. I know I wasn't the mother you needed, but I want to change. I want to make things right. Emily blinked back, the tears threatening to fall. She wanted to say something, to reassure her mother, but the words were stuck in her throat. All this time, all these years, she had wondered if her mother would ever come to terms with the pain she had caused. And now, to hear these words from her, words that carried so much weight, so much regret, made her heart ache with a mixture of sadness and relief. I just want to be here for you, Mom, Emily whispered, her voice soft. You don't have to change anything. I'm just glad you're here. That's all that matters. Samantha's eyes softened, and a tear slid down her cheek. I love you, Emily. I always have. I just never knew how to show it. Emily squeezed her mother's hand, holding back her own tears. I know, Mom. I know. For a long moment, they simply sat there together, the unspoken bond between them stronger than any words could convey. In the silence of the room, Emily realized something that had eluded her for so long. Her mother wasn't perfect, but she had always tried. She had always done what she could with the tools she had, even if those tools weren't enough. And that, Emily realized, was enough. It was all she could ever ask for. As the evening wore on, the doctors came and went, checking Samantha's progress, adjusting her treatment, and updating Emily on the next steps. Each small improvement in her mother's condition felt like a victory, and for the first time in days, Emily allowed herself to hope. That night, as Emily sat by her mother's side, watching her sleep peacefully, she felt something shift within herself. The heavy weight of fear, the constant worry that had consumed her, began to ease, bit by bit. For the first time in a long while, she let herself believe in the possibility of healing, in the possibility of a future where things could get better. And as the darkness of the hospital room settled around them, Emily found herself smiling, not just because her mother was awake, but because she had come to realize something important, that even in the darkest times, there could be light. That even after everything, there could still be hope. Her mother was awake, and that was just the beginning. The days following Samantha's awakening were a whirlwind of medical appointments, follow-up treatments, and constant monitoring. The doctors were optimistic, but they weren't yet willing to declare Samantha fully out of danger. She was still fragile, still struggling to regain her strength, and Emily remained ever watchful, unwilling to leave her side for more than a few moments at a time. Daniel, however, continued to be a steady presence in their lives, quietly observing from the edges, always there when needed, but never overstepping his bounds. His quiet support had become a lifeline for Emily, a constant reminder that she wasn't alone in this. But even so, she knew he had his own life, his own concerns, and she couldn't help but feel a pang of guilt every time he dropped by to check on them. One evening, after another long day at the hospital, Daniel arrived, a briefcase in hand. His brow furrowed in thought as he entered the room. Samantha had been resting, her breathing even, and Emily had just stepped out for a short break to get a cup of coffee. When she returned to the room, she found Daniel sitting beside her mother's bed, looking unusually serious. "Everything okay?" Emily asked, a little taken aback by his somber expression. Daniel glanced up at her, his features softening slightly. "There's something I've been meaning to talk to you about." Emily raised an eyebrow. "What's going on?" He hesitated for a moment, clearly unsure how to proceed. Finally, he spoke, his voice quiet but firm. "It's about you and your mom." Emily's heart skipped a beat. She had thought of everything they could possibly need: the treatments, the recovery, the hospital bills, but she hadn't really considered what would happen when her mother was well enough to leave. They didn't have a home to go back to. They didn't have a safe place to stay. "We don't have anywhere to go," Emily said, the words slipping out before she could stop them. "Once Mom is discharged, we'll have nowhere." Daniel studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable, before he finally spoke again. "I know. That's why I wanted to talk to you. I've been thinking about it, and I want to offer you a place to stay. Here, with me." The words hung in the air for a long moment, and Emily stared at him, unable to fully comprehend what he was saying. "You mean with you?" she asked slowly, her voice tentative. "You want us to live with you?" Daniel nodded, his gaze steady. "Yes, I know this is sudden, but I've been thinking about how much you've been through. You and your mom. You don't deserve to be facing this alone. You've done enough. I want to help, and if this is something that would make things easier for you, I'm offering it." Emily blinked, stunned. "But why? Why are you doing this? You don't even know us. We're practically strangers." Daniel's eyes softened, and for a moment, his usual guarded demeanor slipped. "I know it might seem strange, but the thing is, Emily, I've been where you are. I've been alone. I've had to fight to make sure the people I care about are okay. And what I've learned is that sometimes you need to accept help. You need to let people in." His words hit her with surprising force, a realization stirring deep within her. She had been so focused on doing everything herself, so determined not to rely on anyone else, that she hadn't noticed how much she needed support, how much they both needed it. "I don't know what to say," Emily whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "This is all just so much. I don't want to take advantage of you. You've already done so much." Daniel shook his head, his expression gentle but resolute. "You're not taking advantage of me. I'm offering because I want to. I've seen what you and your mom have been through, and I know this isn't going to be easy, but maybe together we can make it easier. I'm not asking for anything in return. I just want to help." For a moment, Emily stood there, caught between conflicting emotions. Her instinct told her to refuse, to protect herself and her mother, to avoid becoming indebted to anyone else. But another part of her, the part that had watched her mother suffer, that had fought through endless obstacles, recognized the truth in Daniel's offer. He wasn't just offering a place to stay. He was offering something deeper. He was offering a chance for them to rebuild, a chance for them to heal. And maybe, just maybe, it was time to accept the help. She looked over at her mother, who had stirred in her sleep, her hand resting lightly on the edge of the bed. Emily could feel the weight of the decision bearing down on her, but she also felt a glimmer of hope that she hadn't allowed herself to feel in a long time. "Okay," Emily said finally, her voice steady but full of emotion. "Okay, we'll take you up on your offer. We'll stay with you." Daniel's face softened, and for the first time in days, he allowed himself a small, relieved smile. "Good. It's the right decision, Emily. I know it is." And in that moment, as she stood there, her mother's hand in hers and Daniel by her side, Emily realized something important. Life wasn't about trying to carry the weight of the world alone. It wasn't about fighting battles in isolation. It was about accepting the help when it came, about opening up to the possibility of change. It was about letting people in. And, for the first time in a long time, Emily felt like maybe, just maybe, everything would be okay. The next few weeks passed in a blur of new routines and small adjustments. Emily and her mother, Samantha, settled into Daniel's home, and although the transition wasn't always smooth, there was a quiet sense of comfort in the unfamiliar. Samantha, still recovering, was often too tired to do much, but Emily could see the spark of life slowly returning to her. Each day, she seemed a little stronger, a little more present. The house was filled with soft laughter, quiet conversations, and the occasional clink of dishes in the kitchen. It was an atmosphere Emily had not known in so long. It was peaceful. As for Daniel, he proved to be everything he had promised. He wasn't intrusive, but he was there when needed, always respectful of their space and their need to heal. He never asked for anything in return, but somehow, through his quiet generosity, he became an integral part of their lives. Emily noticed how he would take time out of his busy days to check in on Samantha, making sure she had everything she needed. He brought them small gifts, not out of obligation, but because he genuinely cared. It was strange at first, this kindness from a man who had once seemed so distant and cold. But as the days wore on, Emily began to see the man behind the walls. The man who had once been a stranger was now someone she could count on. One evening, after a particularly difficult day with Samantha's treatment, Emily found herself sitting in the living room, her mind still racing with worry. Samantha had taken a turn for the worse that afternoon, and Emily couldn't shake the fear that things might go wrong. She had been holding it together for so long, but the cracks were starting to show. She felt a hand gently rest on her shoulder, and she looked up to see Daniel standing there, his expression soft, but filled with understanding. "You look like you need a break," Daniel said, his voice warm, yet laced with concern. "Why don't you get some rest? I'll take care of things here." Emily shook her head, refusing to be dismissed. "I can't. I can't stop worrying about her. What if she doesn't make it? What if I lose her?" Daniel knelt down beside her, his presence grounding. "Emily, listen to me. I know it's hard. I know it feels like you're carrying the weight of the world, but you don't have to do it alone. I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere." His words were simple, but they carried a weight of reassurance that she hadn't realized she needed. For the first time in what felt like forever, she allowed herself to breathe. She allowed herself to lean on someone else. She let the tension in her shoulders loosen, and the tears that had been building up for days finally spilled over. "I'm scared," Emily whispered, her voice barely above a sob. "I'm scared of losing her. I don't know what I'll do without her." Daniel didn't speak right away. Instead, he gently pulled her into a hug, a gesture that was more comforting than anything she could have imagined. "You're not going to lose her, Emily. You're strong. You're doing everything you can. And sometimes that's all we can do. The rest, it's out of our hands." She clung to him for a moment, letting herself feel the warmth of his support, the kindness that she had been too afraid to accept. In that moment, Emily realized something crucial. She had spent so much of her life trying to control everything, trying to keep it all together, to make sure nothing slipped through her fingers. But life didn't work that way. There were things beyond her control, things that could break her heart and leave her standing in the rubble. But there were also moments of grace, moments where help came from unexpected places, moments when the future felt uncertain, but there was still hope. The next morning, as Emily walked into her mother's room, she was greeted with a soft, almost imperceptible smile from Samantha. It was small, but it was there. Samantha's eyes were clearer, more focused, and for the first time in days, her expression held a quiet sense of peace. Emily's heart swelled with a mixture of relief and joy. Her mother was coming back to her, piece by piece. Over the course of the next few weeks, Samantha's health continued to improve, and the fear that had once gripped Emily began to loosen. She found herself laughing more often, her shoulders less burdened by the weight of worry. They began to make plans for the future, small ones at first, grocery shopping together, cooking meals, making the house feel more like home. Emily even found herself looking ahead, imagining a future that wasn't just about survival, but about living, about thriving. One afternoon, after Samantha had taken a nap, Emily and Daniel found themselves sitting on the porch, the quiet hum of the evening air surrounding them. The sun was beginning to set, casting a golden hue across the sky, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Emily felt at peace. "I don't know how to thank you," she said, her voice soft but filled with gratitude. "For everything. For helping us. For being here." Daniel looked over at her, his expression thoughtful. "You don't have to thank me, Emily. I did it because I wanted to. I did it because I believe in second chances. And I believe in you." Her heart fluttered at his words, and for a moment, she didn't know what to say. There was so much she wanted to express, but she didn't have the words for it. Instead, she simply smiled, a smile that came from deep within her, a smile that reflected everything she had learned over the past few months, about family, about strength, about hope. And in that quiet moment, as the world around them slowed and the last rays of the sun dipped below the horizon, Emily realized that her life was changing. It wasn't perfect, and it wouldn't be easy, but it was a new beginning. A beginning she could share with her mother, with Daniel, with the people who had helped her believe that she wasn't alone. There would be challenges ahead. There always were. But for the first time in a long time, Emily felt ready to face them, because she knew she didn't have to face them alone. And that, she realized, was enough. Thank you all for taking the time to listen to this story. I hope that these moments we shared have brought you meaningful emotions and reflections. If you enjoyed the story or found it touching, please don't forget to like, share it to spread the love, and subscribe to the channel for more captivating stories. Make sure to hit the notification bell so you won't miss any new videos. Thanks again, and I look forward to seeing you in the next story.